Houghton County, Michigan, September 1898. The air, even in the late summer sun, carried a warning. It was a crispness that clung to the shadows, a premonition of the iron-hard cold that would soon clamp down on the Keweenaw Peninsula. On a small plot of cleared land miles from the nearest copper mine, a man was doing something that made no sense. His name was Vincas Šimkus, a recent arrival from Lithuania, and he was not building a cabin. He was building what looked to the loggers and miners like a giant, upside-down basket. For weeks, he had been harvesting young, straight ash saplings from the surrounding woods. Now, he was bending them, their green wood groaning in protest into a low, curved dome, 80 poles in all, their bases planted in a perfect 18-foot circle, their tips lashed with tarred rope to a complex lattice at the apex. Wendell Halpern, the clerk from the company commissary, pulled his buggy to a stop on the rutted track that passed for a road. Beside him, a broad-shouldered logger named Silas Croft spat a stream of tobacco juice into the dust. "What in God's name is the immigrant doing now?" Croft grumbled, gesturing with his chin. Halpern squinted. He was a man who dealt in numbers, in inventory, in the predictable needs of hard-working men: flour, salt pork, blasting powder, and sturdy wool blankets. Šimkus's structure did not compute. It had no straight lines, no right angles, no proud peak to shed the coming snow. "Looks like he's weaving a beaver lodge," Halpern said, a dry chuckle in his voice. The comment was good enough that he'd repeat it later to the men lined up for credit at the commissary. "It's madness," Croft declared, shaking his head. "That thing will collapse under the first heavy snow, or the wind will peel it open like a piece of fruit. The man's a fool, plain and simple. He'll get his family frozen before Christmas." The men watched for a few more minutes as Šimkus, a quiet, methodical figure, moved with an unhurried rhythm, his work guided by a logic they could not perceive. He never looked up, never acknowledged their judgment. The mockery was a language he didn't need to speak. The coming winter would speak for him. What did this quiet Lithuanian homestead builder understand about mass and wind, the physics of a Lake Superior winter, that the experienced men of the copper country, with their axes and their saws and their straight-walled cabins, had missed? If you appreciate stories of quiet genius and practical wisdom triumphing over conventional thinking, I encourage you to subscribe to our channel. We believe the most powerful stories are often the quietest ones, and in the next few minutes I promise you will learn exactly how a dome's geometry and a blanket of simple earth can defeat a blizzard. We'd also love to hear your thoughts in the comments. Have you ever seen an earth-sheltered home? Or do you know of any building traditions that use the ground itself for insulation? Vincas Šimkus was not a miner, accustomed to the dark and the damp deep below ground. He was not a logger, whose life was a contest between sharp steel and standing timber. He was not a frontiersman in the American sense, a man defined by a long rifle and a restless spirit. Vincas was a Sodibos Statibaninkas. The words felt foreign on the Michigan air, but in his mind, they held the weight and texture of a lifetime. He was a homesteader builder from the rolling, wind-swept hills of Žemaitija in western Lithuania. His hands, now calloused from the American axe, remembered different tools, different materials. They remembered the feel of river stone, slick with moss, used for foundation courses. They remembered the heft of broad-bladed spades for cutting valena, the thick, root-matted sod of ancient pastures. They remembered the precise curve of a bowed rafter, bent not with steam, but with the patient pressure of weight and time, designed to shed the gales that blew in from the Baltic Sea. He had not built with logs stacked like bricks, but with earth and grass and woven saplings, creating structures that seemed to grow from the land, rather than being imposed upon it. He, his wife Lena, and their two small children, Jonas and Emilija, had come to America for a piece of land they could truly own. But their first winter in the Keweenaw had been a brutal education in the failures of local custom. They had rented a small, hastily built cabin near the mine, a simple box of green logs chinked with mud and moss that shrank and crumbled as the temperature plummeted. That winter was a series of small, accumulating miseries that Vincus recorded not in a journal, but in the memory of his senses. He remembered Lena's felt mittens, freezing solid to the iron door handle, tearing a patch of wool when she finally pulled the door open. He remembered the loaf of bread on the cutting board, baked just the day before, so frozen it rang like a stone when tapped with a knife. He remembered the barn cat's water bowl, which he filled each evening, finding it the next morning a perfect, solid hemisphere of clear ice, the surface unblemished. He remembered the endless, insidious drafts that seemed to knife through the solid-looking walls, forcing them to huddle around the small stove, feeding it a constant diet of precious cordwood, while their backs remained cold. The children were never without a cough. Lena's face grew pale and pinched. Vincus, a man who had built warm homes his entire life, felt a deep, personal shame. He had brought his family across an ocean only to fail at the most basic of tasks, keeping them warm. Standing in that frigid cabin, he made a silent vow. Never again. He would not trust the local ways. He would trust the earth. The problem with the standard frontier cabin wasn't the material. A log, thick and solid, held a decent amount of insulating value. The problem was geometry and air. The conventional cabins that dotted the landscape of Houghton County were monuments to right angles. They were boxes with peaked roofs, a design imported from milder, less windy climates in Europe and New England. On the Keweenaw Peninsula, where Lake Superior brewed some of the most violent winter weather on the continent, this design was a catastrophic failure of physics. The primary enemy was not just the cold, it was the wind. A 50-mile-per-hour wind at 0 degrees Fahrenheit has the same effect on exposed skin, or a cabin wall, as a temperature of 40 below in calm air. This phenomenon, convective heat loss, was the invisible thief that haunted every family. The sharp, 90-degree corners of a cabin and the steep pitch of its roof acted like spoilers on an airplane, creating immense turbulence. As the wind slammed into a flat wall, it didn't flow past. It tumbled and eddied, scrubbing heat from the logs with terrifying efficiency. The wind would find every tiny crack in the chinking, every gap around the window frames, and turn it into a superhighway for cold air. Abe Mueller, a German farmer whose land bordered Shimkus's claim, lived inside a perfect example of this failure. His cabin was well built by local standards, with tightly fitted logs and fresh chinking applied every autumn. Yet the fight against the cold was a losing battle. From November to April, his cast iron stove glowed a dull red, consuming a staggering amount of wood. Still, the corners of his main room were always rimed with a delicate lacework of frost. His wife, Martha, kept a kettle steaming on the stove constantly, yet the air remained dry and raw. She suffered from a deep, rattling cough all winter, a common affliction in the region known grimly as cabin lung. Abe would watch Vincus building his strange dirt mound and shake his head with a mixture of pity and contempt. He was following the proven method, working twice as hard as any man had a right to, and still, his home was a sieve. He couldn't imagine what foolishness would lead a man to trade solid wood walls for a pile of dirt. He, like everyone else, saw the structure, but he couldn't see the science. The construction of the dome was an act of quiet, deliberate rebellion against every local building norm. It began with the circle, inscribed in the earth, 18 feet in diameter. Vincus dug a shallow trench along this line, a footing for the 80 ash poles he had felled and stripped. He worked with green wood, a practice that horrified local carpenters who prized seasoned timber. But Vincas needed the wood's flexibility. One by one, he set the thick base of each pole into the trench. Then, using his own body weight and a simple rope and lever system, he bent the slender tops inward. Each pole groaned, resisting before finally submitting to the curve. At the center of the dome, he had erected a king post, a stout central column with a spoked wheel of timber at its top. This was the hub, the anchor for the entire structure. He and Lena, working together on a crude scaffold, lashed the tip of each bent pole to this central lattice. The work was slow, repetitive, and precise. As the poles went up, a beautiful, complex skeleton emerged, a web of parabolic curves, strong and flexible, that already seemed to shrug at the idea of a straight, hard wind. The interior felt like a cathedral of saplings. Once the frame was complete, the real work began. Vincas took his spade not to the forest, but to the meadow. He was harvesting sod, but not in the way a farmer would. He cut long, thick rectangles of earth, at least a foot deep, rich with the tangled root mass of prairie grasses. He then transported these heavy slabs on a stone boat pulled by his single ox. This was the part that drew the most open mockery. He began laying the sod at the base of the dome in a thick ring, and he laid it grass down. Wendell Halpern, stopping by on his way back from a delivery, couldn't contain his derision. "Shimkus," he called out, "you've got it upside down. The grass grows toward the sun, not toward your floor." Vincas paused, wiped sweat from his brow with the back of his wrist, and gave a small, polite nod. "The roots make a better seal this way," he said, his English slow and heavily accented. He offered no further explanation. He simply turned back to his work, heaving another 80-pound slab of earth into place. The grass-down method ensured that as the buried turf decomposed, it would mat together, eliminating the seams and creating a single, monolithic layer. The roots, in their final act, would stitch his home together. He laid 3 concentric rings of sod, each overlapping the one below, working his way up the dome. The final layer was a cap, 3 feet thick, of tamped earth and clay. The structure no longer looked like a basket. It was a smooth, green-brown hill rising from the flat ground, punctuated only by a small, stone-lined doorway and a single stovepipe at its peak. But he wasn't finished. This was the part no one understood. As the first hard frosts of October arrived, Vincas and Lena hauled buckets of water from their well and began to soak the entire dome. They saturated the 3-foot-thick layer of sod and earth until it could absorb no more. The water trickled down through the soil, filling every air pocket. That night, the temperature dropped to 20 degrees. The water froze. The next day, they did it again. They soaked the mound a second time, and a second time, it froze solid. In the commissary, Wendell Halpern refined his critique. "Mark my words," he announced to the line of men waiting for their weekly provisions. "That hill of his is going to hold every drop of meltwater come spring. He's built his family a swamp. They'll be sleeping in mud by April." The men laughed. It was a good line, logical and damning. A house made of frozen mud seemed the height of immigrant folly, but Vincas hadn't built a house of mud. He had built a house of thermal mass, encased in a shell of ice. The genius of the sod dome rested on 2 fundamental principles of physics that Vincas Shimkus understood in his bones, if not in the language of a textbook: thermal mass and aerodynamics. First, the mass. The structure was, in essence, a man-made hill. The 3-foot-thick layer of sod and earth, compacted and frozen solid, weighed an estimated 40 tons. This immense weight was not just structural. It was a thermal battery. While the thin log walls of a conventional cabin had an R value, a measure of thermal resistance, of perhaps R4 or R5, The dense frozen earth of the dome achieved an R value of nearly R9, and that was before the snow. Once the inevitable blanket of winter snow covered the dome, that R value would skyrocket, with every foot of settled snow adding another R10 to the total. The house would be wearing the blizzard like a down coat. This concept of thermal mass meant the dome resisted changes in temperature. While a log cabin would begin to lose its heat the moment the fire in the stove died down, the 40 tons of earth in the dome would soak up the heat from the small cook stove all day long. It would absorb BTUs, storing them in the very fabric of the walls. At night, as the fire dwindled to coals, the walls themselves would begin to radiate that stored heat back into the small living space. The house became its own heater. The second principle, aerodynamics, was even more elegant. A square cabin with a peaked roof is an obstacle to wind. Vincke's dome was a partner to it. A typical 18 by 18-foot cabin presented a large, flat wall to the prevailing westerlies, creating maximum drag and turbulence. The curved profile of the dome, however, presented approximately 22% less surface area to a direct wind. More importantly, its shape was aerodynamic. The wind didn't slam into the dome. It flowed smoothly over its curved surface. This is known as laminar flow. With no sharp corners or eaves to create turbulence, the wind had less opportunity to scrub heat away. The convective heat loss, the single greatest enemy of a frontier cabin, was drastically reduced simply by changing the building's shape. While his neighbors were fighting a constant, losing battle against wind and cold, Vincke had designed a home that made the wind an irrelevance and used the cold to freeze his walls into a solid, insulating monolith. He wasn't just building a shelter. He was orchestrating a subtle collaboration with the harsh physics of a northern winter. He was using the enemy's own weapons, the frost and the snow, to build his defense. The laughter from the road was the sound of men who saw a pile of dirt and missed the brilliant, simple equation it represented. That November, winter did not arrive. It attacked. A ferocious system of Lake Superior lake-effect snow stalled over the Keweenaw Peninsula, unleashing a siege that would be spoken of for decades. For 11 straight days, the sky was a churning, leaden mass. Snow fell not in flakes, but in blinding horizontal sheets, driven by intermittent 50-mile-per-hour winds that gusted off the frozen surface of the Great Lake. These winds picked up ice pellets from the ground, creating shimmering, stinging curtains of white that reduced visibility to a few feet. The temperature hovered at an average of 18 degrees below zero, and when the wind howled, the effective temperature was a life-threatening 50 below. For Abe Muller and his family, it was a waking nightmare. Their cabin became an island in a sea of white. The wind, a shrieking demon, found its way through every seal. It screamed in the eaves and whistled around the window frames. Frost grew thick on the nailheads inside the walls, tracing the path of the cold. They had moved their beds and all their furniture into a tight circle around the stove, creating a small camp of survival in the center of their own home. Abe was outside 4 times a day, fighting his way through waist-deep drifts to the woodpile, his arms burning with cold as he carried in load after load. They were burning through their winter supply of wood at an unsustainable rate. The cabin was a machine for consuming fuel and producing misery. Meanwhile, under a 15-foot mound of pure white snow, life in the Shimkus Dome continued with an almost surreal tranquility. The shrieking of the 50-mile-per-hour wind was gone, replaced by a deep, low hum, the sound of the immense pressure far overhead. The 18 feet of snow that had buried their neighbors and paralyzed the county had become their final, perfect layer of insulation. Inside, the air was still, utterly still. The small stove, fed with a modest amount of wood, kept the single circular room at a comfortable temperature. This was where the small details of domestic life became profound statements of success. Lena kneaded bread dough on a simple wooden board set on a table. The dough was soft and pliable, rising slowly in the gentle warmth. The air smelled of yeast and the faint, pleasant scent of the drying herbs she had hung from the sapling rafters. Vinkus sat on a low stool, mending a piece of harness leather, his fingers nimble and sure, not stiff with cold. The children, Jonas and Emilia, played quietly on a rug on the floorboards, and on a small shelf carved into the earthen wall, a single object stood as silent, unimpeachable proof of the dome's triumph. It was a glass jar of pickled cucumbers Lena had put up in the fall. In every other cabin in Houghton County, such a jar, if left anywhere but directly beside the stove, would have been a solid plug of clouded, green ice. Abe Muller's wife had broken 2 knives trying to pry frozen pickles from a similar jar. But here, in the Shimkus dome, the brine in the jar was clear and liquid. When 7-year-old Jonas accidentally bumped the shelf, the cucumbers sloshed softly against the glass. The water inside the pickles remained water. In a world frozen solid, this small, mundane fact was a miracle of physics. It meant the temperature inside the dome, even against the earth-packed outer wall, had not once dipped below 32 degrees Fahrenheit. On the 8th day of the siege, a man on horseback appeared at the edge of Vinkus's clearing, looking more like a ghost of snow than a human being. He was Dr. Eris Thorne, the county physician, a man in his late 50s with a tired face and a chronic, hacking cough born of too many winters spent in sick rooms. He had been making his rounds, checking on families known to have tuberculosis, a journey that was now a desperate struggle for his own survival. His horse was exhausted, and he was disoriented in the whiteout. He had been following what he thought was a fence line when he saw it. A faint, almost invisible wisp of smoke rising from a mound of snow. He thought it was a steam vent in the earth, but then he realized it was too steady. Hope, desperate and thin, flickered in his chest. He slid from his horse and stumbled through the deep, powdery drifts toward the smoke. He found the top of a stone-lined doorway, a dark archway leading down into the snow. He half fell down the 3 steps and pounded on the thick wooden door. When Vinkus opened it, the doctor was met not with the expected blast of frigid, damp air, but with a wall of calm. He staggered inside, covered head to foot in ice and snow, and stood there for a moment, blinking. He braced himself for the chill he always felt near the floor of a frontier cabin, the biting draft that seemed to suck the heat from a man's ankles. But it wasn't there. As he stomped the snow from his heavy boots onto the small mat by the door, he felt nothing. The air was perfectly still. The floorboards under his feet were cool, but not the soul-leeching cold of frozen timber. Lena helped him out of his frozen coat and gave him a hot cup of tea. He explained his situation, his voice raspy from his persistent cough. He had been in and out of a dozen drafty, desperate cabins that week, and the chill had settled deep in his lungs, leaving a heavy, painful weight in his chest. The Shimkus family insisted he stay the night, offering him a cot along the eastern arc of the dome. Exhausted, he accepted, expecting a fitful, coughing night. He slept for 10 hours straight. When he awoke, the first thing he noticed was the silence. The wind was still audible, but it was a distant bass rumble, not a scream. The second thing he noticed was his own body. He took a breath. It was deep. It was easy. The familiar, heavy congestion in his chest, the feeling of tight, inflamed airways he carried with him all winter, was gone. He sat up and took another breath, then another. He had slept through an entire night in the midst of a historic blizzard without coughing once. He looked around the small, warm, circular room. He saw the sleeping family, the gently glowing coals in the stove, the jar of pickles on the wall. He looked at the thick, curved earthen walls, feeling the faint, radiant warmth they gave off. He understood in that moment that he was not inside a building. He was inside a different idea altogether. Vincus was awake, adding a single small log to the stove. Dr. Thorne swung his legs off the cot and walked over to the Lithuanian, his movements freer than they had been in months. He placed a hand on the curved, sod-packed wall. It was cool, solid, and dry. He looked at Vincus, a deep and profound respect dawning in his eyes. He had seen hundreds of cabins, hundreds of families struggling against the Michigan winter. He had seen death by pneumonia, by influenza, by the sheer exhaustion of being cold. What he was seeing here was the antidote. "Mr. Shimkus," the doctor said, his voice quiet with awe. He struggled to find the words. "All these years we've been building walls to fight the winter." He patted the solid earth. You didn't build a house." He paused, searching for the right comparison, the right image to capture the revolutionary simplicity of the structure. He looked from the curved wall to the quiet man who had built it. "My God, man. You built a hillside." The vindication was complete. It wasn't an argument won, but a reality experienced. When the great storm finally broke, Dr. Thorne stayed for another day, documenting everything. He measured the interior and exterior temperatures. He calculated the wood consumption, which he found to be less than a quarter of a comparable log cabin's. He noted the dry air, the lack of drafts, the quiet. He was a man of science, and he recognized the data of a successful experiment when he saw it. He returned to the town of Houghton not just with a story of survival, but with a medical case study. That spring, in 1899, he stood before the assembled physicians of the Lake Superior Medical Society. He didn't speak of architecture or immigrant novelty. He spoke of public health. He presented his paper, titled Observations on Shelter-Induced Respiratory Recovery in Extreme Winter Conditions. He described the high incidence of tuberculosis, pneumonia, and chronic bronchitis in the poorly heated, draft-ridden cabins of the region. Then he described the Shimkus Dome. He framed it not as a home, but as a therapeutic environment. The stable temperature, he argued, reduced stress on the lungs. The lack of drafts prevented the constant irritation that led to inflammation. The higher relative humidity, a natural consequence of the earthen walls, soothed bronchial passages. He concluded that the very design of the shelter could be a primary tool in treating and preventing the respiratory diseases that plagued the North Country. The presentation caused a stir. The idea that a building could heal was radical. A house wasn't just a box to keep out the snow. Its design was an active participant in the health of its occupants. The society requested copies of Dr. Thorne's sketches of the dome's construction. By the autumn of 1899, those sketches had made their way to sanatoria in Marquette and Sault Ste. Marie. Administrators of the tuberculosis wards, desperate for any advantage in their fight against the white plague, saw the potential. Plans were drawn up for patient cottages and recovery wards based on the principles of the Lithuanians' sod dome. Low, curved profiles, thick earthen walls, and a design that worked with the winter, not against it. The idea spread not as a strange way to build a house, but as an intelligent way to save a life. What Vincus Shimkus had built on his small plot of land was, in essence, a high-performance home, nearly a century before the terms for it existed. Modern building science, with its focus on concepts like the passive house standard, emphasizes the very principles he had employed: an airtight building envelope to control ventilation and eliminate drafts, a massive amount of insulation to create a stable interior climate, a design that minimizes thermal bridging and maximizes the benefit of passive heat sources. Vincus, using only ash saplings, sod, and the folk knowledge passed down through generations of Jamaidijan builders, had achieved a level of thermal performance that modern architects struggle to reach with engineered materials and complex systems. He had demonstrated that the oldest wisdom and the most advanced science often arrive at the same quiet truth. The story of the sod dome is more than a tale of clever engineering. It's a quiet lesson in philosophy. The prevailing mindset of the American frontier was one of conquest. Man was pitted against nature. Forests were to be cleared, mountains to be mined, rivers to be dammed. A house was a fortress, a bastion with straight, defiant walls raised against the wilderness. It stood on the land. Vincus Shimkus operated from a different understanding, one of partnership rather than conflict. He did not seek to conquer the winter. He sought to join with the one thing more powerful and more ancient than any storm, the earth itself. The planet beneath his feet maintained a stable temperature, an immense, unshakable thermal equilibrium. He didn't build a roof to fight the snow. He built a structure that invited the snow to become its blanket. He didn't build walls to block the wind. He shaped them to guide the wind away. In the end, he didn't really build a house at all. He simply pulled a corner of the earth over his sleeping family and let the storm rage on, unheard in another world, far above their heads. If you enjoyed this story of ingenuity and resilience, please consider liking this video and subscribing for more tales of forgotten history. And let us know in the comments, what other old world building techniques do you know of that were perfectly suited for a new environment? Your insights help keep these stories alive. This video presents historically inspired reconstructions for educational and storytelling purposes. The characters, names, and specific events depicted are fictional, while the techniques and scientific principles are based on real historical practices. Any application of these or similar techniques in a modern context should be done in accordance with current building codes, safety guidelines, and professional regulations. This content does not constitute professional, technical, or legal advice.